This is your screencast on the literary device of character. So, a character is a person portrayed in literature. However, some authors choose to have animals, creatures, machines as characters. In this case, the author is using what's called personification to give those critters human qualities, whether they talk or walk or dress like a human or they have emotions. Those critters can be characters if they are personified or treated as if they were a person. Whoops. So, sorry, let me go backwards. There are two major divisions of characters that we're going to look at to start with. We talk about what are known as the major, main, or central characters, and different teachers will use those three words as synonyms. But major characters are those characters that are vital to the story. The story doesn't exist without them. And usually those characters are directly involved in the conflict and the resolution. The plot revolves around the major characters. There is no story, Boy of the Painted Cave, without Tao. He is a major character. Katniss is the major character in the Hunger Games. Harry Potter is a major character in Harry Potter. On the other hand, minor characters are not as essential. They complement the major character, they help the story become more detailed, but they aren't needed for the story to exist. So we don't need Garth to have Boy of the Painted Cave. Sometimes there's different shades of major or minor characters. So in something like Harry Potter, Ron and Hermione are needed for that story. So they are major characters. They're not as major as Harry Potter, but we definitely need them. In Boy of the Painted Cave, the story would not be the same without Ram or Greybeard. So those are probably major characters. Kala is not quite as important, but Garth is definitely a minor character. So again, it's not a one or the other. There is some ground in between. Another way we can look at characters is we can talk about them being what's known as round or flat. This doesn't mean that they're round as in snowmen or fat. It means that they are well developed, that we as a reader know a lot about those characters. The author gives us tons of details or information about them. So the main character, the hero or heroine in a story, is almost always round. Like, we need to know a lot about our heroes in order for them to be heroes. On the other hand, a flat character, it's not that it's Flat Stanley, but a flat character technically is a character that's not described very well, that we don't have a lot of detail about. We know a little bit about them, often one bit of their personality or kind of one glimpse as to what they look like. So it could be somebody like Bruce in Finding Nemo. We know a slice of his personality, but we don't know anything about his childhood, etc. Or Mr. Filch in Harry Potter. We know he's sort of grumpy and always has a cat, but we don't know why or what caused that or what he does in his spare time. Those are flat characters, and we just are not given much detail about them. And again, you can have characters that are somewhat in between. So we definitely know more about Professor Dumbledore or Professor McGonagall than we do about Mr. Filch. We certainly know a lot more about Ron and Hermione. So we can have different degrees of flatness or roundness, and that's up to the author how much information they give the reader. Another way that we talk about characters is what's called dynamic or static characters. Dynamic characters are almost always going to be your major characters, and they are changed by the conflict in the story. They usually, in young adult novels, they somehow get better or improve. So they are more fully developed. The change is what develops them. We learn more about them. We learn how they go from being dependent and weak to independent and strong, how they go from being afraid to being fearless. So that's what a dynamic character would be. They change over the course of the story. And certainly Tao changes. He goes from somebody who's very like self-conscious and trying to hide his creativity to being much more independent, much more strong and much more convinced of his right to be creative. Similarly, somebody like Anakin Skywalker, he really changes a lot during the course of the story or stories. Katniss changes. And this picture up in the corner, that would be Scrooge, if you know Ebenezer Scrooge, and he is changed by his encounter with the three ghosts. Heroes are supposed to be dynamic. That's why we like them, is because they do change. A static character is a character who stays the same, who doesn't change at all, or who changes just a little bit. It's the opposite of a dynamic character. And because they don't change, they're often flat. What we see at the beginning is what we know at the end, and nothing changes in between. And so something like Cinderella's evil stepmother and stepsisters, they're mean at the beginning, they're mean at the end, and that's all we know about them. Caesar Flickerman of the Hunger Games, he's kind of creepy at the beginning, and he's still kind of creepy at the end. Garfield is one of the few heroes that might be static, if you can call Garfield a hero. He has been the same for over 40 years. He's lazy, likes lasagna, and wants to torment Odie, and that's pretty much it. So he doesn't change at all. But normally our heroes are dynamic and round, and our minor characters tend to be flat and static. So, like I just said, round characters tend to be dynamic characters. The reason we know about them is because they change a lot over the course of the story. But you can actually have exceptions to that rule. And Hermione Granger is a good example in my mind. She is very round. We know a lot about her, especially as we keep reading through that series. But she pretty much stays the same from book to book. Yeah, she gets older, she ages, but her personality is pretty much the same. She's always smart, a little bit sassy, very independent, and very strong-willed, and very true to her sense of morality. That always stays the same. You might argue that she changes a little bit, that maybe she becomes a little bit more adventurous and rule breaking as the story goes on, but she's relatively static compared to some of our other characters. And it's usually flat characters who are the static ones. We don't know much about them, and they don't seem to change at all during the course of the story. Katniss's sister Primrose is an example of that. She's kind of weak and helpless at the beginning, and she's like that at the end, and we feel like we don't really know her as a character. But again, there's exceptions to that pairing. Every once in a while, we can have a flat character who's dynamic, and that's not an easy thing to write because it means we don't know a lot about them, but they change dramatically over the course of the story. One of the few examples that I could get was Thresh from the Hunger Games. And for those of you who don't know the story, he's opposed to Katniss. And in the beginning of the story, all we know is that he pretty much wants to kill her so that he can survive. But because Katniss saves his friend Rue, Thresh has a dramatic change. And not only does he not kill Katniss, but he saves her at one point in the story. And that's all we know about him. And that's a pretty big change. Again, we have our concepts of character and different ways that we can measure character. And we need to think about that as we write our story.